Welcome to this webinar. My name is Josie Gibson, and I'm the Education and Community Engagement Manager with OARC. And today we have the privilege of welcoming Sharon and Katelynn, two of our colleagues from Behavioural Supports Ontario, who are going to take us through a presentation over the next hour. Just before we begin, I would like to let you know that this webinar will be recorded for educational purposes. And I have muted all lines at this point in time just to minimize background noise and distraction. I ask that you please keep your lines muted until the end of the presentation, at which point we will have a question and answer period. So at this point, it is my pleasure to introduce both Sharon and Katelynn. Sharon Osvald is the Lived Experience Facilitator, working in partnership with the Behavioural Supports Ontario Provincial Coordinating Office and Brain Exchange. She also coordinates the Southeast Ontario Lived Experience Network for Providence Care, Seniors Mental Health and Alzheimer's Society of Southeast Ontario. And Sharon supports her mother, who lives with vascular dementia in a long-term care home. And Katelynn Viau will be co-presenting with Sharon today. And Katelynn is the project coordinator for the Behavioural Supports Ontario Provincial Coordinating Office. And as part of her role, enjoys being the primary coordinator for all of the BSO Lived Experience as advisory projects. So at this point, I'm just going to unmute both Katelynn and Sharon, and I will turn it over to you for your presentation.
Thank you, Josie Lee. Can you hear me okay?
I can.
Great.
And Katelynn, are you? Can we hear you? You should be unmuted now.
Now it's saying that I'm unmuted. Can you hear me now?
We can, yes.
Beautiful.
So take it away, ladies.
Okay. Well, thank you, and I'm actually really glad to hear Katelynn's voice. I had a little panic there. I would hate to present this all by myself, so we wanted to start with some acknowledgements. We want to first acknowledge the BSO Lived Experience advisors themselves, because they are the true authors of this document. And I'm sure there's some in this room today that are taking part in the webinar that have contributed to this document. So we really want to give a shout out to them at first. Also, we thank Jennifer Langston and Josie Lee Gibson and the OARC team for allowing this to happen today and for inviting us. We want to thank Dr. Rhonda Feldman. She is our BSO Lived Experience Advisory Co-Chair, and the BSO Provincial Coordinating Office team, as well as document reviewers from across the sectors who've helped us to come up with this document. So to start with who we are, I'm the one on the left. My name is Sharon Osvald. That is my mom, Phyllis. And Sunday, Phyllis just celebrated her 89th birthday with us. So she's been living in long-term care now for approximately 8 years. And it was really the challenges and lessons learned as she moved from home to hospital to long-term care that really launched me into this work. Katelynn, I'll let you introduce yourself.
Thanks, Sharon. That's me, Katelynn Viau, on the far right with the rest of the Behavioural Supports Ontario Provincial Coordinating Office team. And as Josie Lee mentioned, I'm the project coordinator and lead collaborator with Sharon and Dr. Rhonda Feldman on all BSO Lived Experience advisory projects. So for today's webinar, Sharon and I will expand a little bit more on our description of the Behavioural Supports Ontario Lived Experience Advisory and let everybody in about the focus of the advisory and some of the work that we've conducted. The majority of our webinar will focus on our Making Connections project. So we'll start with a brief literature review and then dive right into recommendations and the actual personhood tools that are mentioned in the document. And then we'll close off our webinar by discussing opportunities for residents and residents' councils to become involved in this initiative. So I will turn things over to Sharon.
Thank you. So the BSO Lived Experience Advisory, what is that? Well, basically, it's a group of people that unites individuals with lived experience across Ontario to improve care for older adults and their families living with dementia, complex mental health, substance use, and other neurological conditions. And the advisory really launched initially in November of 2015. And it's made up of just a whole slew of people from across the province, from Ottawa to Chatham and in the north. So it really has a nice sense of a provincial lens. What we do is we meet monthly for advisory conversations. We also provide advice to BSO-related initiatives across the province. As well as BSO projects, we've been involved in giving input for things like the dementia strategy, Health Quality Ontario language, guidelines, and many different things. And then we also identify projects that are particularly an interest to the advisory members themselves that they feel they can tackle, and that's what today's about. So when we say lived experience, we're referring to the experience of anyone living with the conditions we mentioned above, our target population, but also the experience of being their care partner, an individual living with these conditions, but also family, friends, anyone who's played an active role in supporting the individual living with the above conditions. That is who makes up our lived experience advisory. So the Personhood Recommendations Project, this became one of the priorities that was really flagged early on by our advisory. And that was to increase awareness and use of the tools that would assist in enhancing the delivery of person and family-centered care across the sectors. And what that really means is there are several tools, as we'll be talking about, ways that people can write down information about a person's personhood, the things they like, the things that give them comfort, the things they enjoy. And that we felt that our members felt that although these tools existed, that people were not filling them out properly. They didn't really understand the purpose for them. Longer versions were hard to read. They weren't being looked at. But they felt this was really essential, because if we don't know a person's values, interests, preferences, history, and they can't speak for themselves, then they aren't receiving true quality care. And we also are setting them up for failure, because we're setting them up in situations where they become agitated or they become unhappy and they are just trying to voice an unmet need. So early on, this became a goal to create recommendations to how to use personhood tools more effectively across the sector. Katelynn.
And before diving into our actual recommendations, there are a couple of things that Sharon and I just really wanted to emphasize. First, that the concept of integrating information related to somebody's personhood is not new. The importance of integrating personhood for those living with dementia was emphasized back in the 90s by a very renowned researcher in this area by the last name of Katelynn, and even before that. A researcher by the last name of Johnson acknowledged that creating the conditions necessary to help older people tell their stories enables a more dynamic and authentic picture of their lives, which empowers health and social care staff to have greater awareness of the person's present-day behaviors, beliefs, and values. So we've known this for a while, that it's very important to integrate persons into care. So we really wanted to develop recommendations that would help put this into practice and help action it. The second thing that we really wanted to emphasize was that although our document was never intended to be published academically, there is really a great evidence base surrounding this topic. The importance of leveraging information about somebody's personhood is noted in various best practice guidelines for various nursing standards, as well as other quality standards of care developed recently by Health Quality Ontario. So despite the fact that we didn't necessarily intend to publish anything academically, we still undertook a small literature review to help us in understanding the topic and what had been done so far in the area and what were some of the theories behind it. And perhaps one of the pieces of research that most resonated with us was some work conducted over in the United Kingdom by a researcher by the last name of Kindle and her colleagues back in 2014. What they did was they studied life story work with people living with dementia and found that there are different points of connection that could benefit them and those who interact with them, whether being family members or professional care partners. So these 4 different types of connections are illustrated here on this slide, and we'll just quickly run through them. So the first one is emotional connections. So essentially better understanding who people are and remembering them as full human beings in order to establish a more caring relationship. The second one, practical care connections. Simple things like whether a person is left or right-handed, so that if you're trying to support them in eating or assisting them in art therapy, you know which hand is their dominant hand, and then therefore you can better support them. It's also important in terms of building new connections. So these are things that help you get to know a person, like where are they from and who are those people that are important to them and what are those names that you're most likely to hear from them. And finally, interactional connections. Things like a person's primary language, knowing how a person prefers to spend their time, whether that's alone, one-on-one, or if they thrive in a small group or large group. So these 4 different points of connection are essential to consider, and you'll see these different points in action once we go through our recommendations. But before that, we just really want to acknowledge, again, the work by Katelynn and her colleagues. It's from this work that we came up with our title of Making Connections. So really wanting to acknowledge them for their work back in 2014. So switching back to our project, we really approached the project with sort of a who, when, why, where, what approach. And we used the following questions to guide our work, which took place over about a year. So all of our questions, all 6 of these questions were cross-sectoral, meaning that we talked about recommendations for people who were living in the community, so still either in their private dwellings or in an apartment or a retirement home. We talked about recommendations for those attending adult day programs. We talked about recommendations for those who were currently in the hospital, whether short-term or long-term stay. And finally, a lot of our conversation focused on the recommendation for long-term care, which is of course our focus for today's webinar. So those 6 questions that we focused on were: which elements of personhood are most helpful to inform care planning? When information about personhood should be documented and how often should it be updated? Who would the information be most helpful for? Where should the information be shared, displayed, or stored? How can people and their families promote the use of the information and really put it to action? And finally, what tools currently exist to promote those elements of personhood that can be used across the sectors? So now Sharon and I will dive into each question and discuss the recommendations for long-term care. So going back to that first question, which was which elements of personhood are most helpful to inform care planning? And of course, today we'll focus on long-term care. In order to uncover all of these different elements of personhood, we conducted an environmental scan of all the personhood tools that we could find online, including tools that many of you may have heard of, such as the Alzheimer's Society's All About Me tool, the This Is Me tool from the Alzheimer's Society in the UK, the Pieces of My Personhood tool, which we'll explore a little bit later, and really any other tool that we could find. And we went through every single one and we listed all of their questions. Afterwards, we split them into 4 categories. So in terms of our time today, we won't go through each element in depth, but just know that the full document is available online for a more fulsome review. So to touch on the first category, which is general information and life overview, we have some concrete elements listed here, such as preferred name, past life role or career. And then on the right, there are some life overview elements that are less concrete, such as things somebody might be most proud of, sources of hope, comfort, joy, inspiration, happiest moments, and significant low points in life. We saw many of these elements incorporated into various personhood tools that are recommended for use in long-term care. The next category encompasses things that are primarily focused on likes and dislikes. So on the left, we have hobbies and interests, and then we have personal care preferences on the right. Our advisory spent a lot of time talking about personal care preferences. It was something that was really emphasized by our advisors and the reviewers of our documents. And I think one of the reasons why it was emphasized was because we know that responsive behaviors do frequently occur during times where personal care is being provided. And therefore, equipping staff and even family care partners and volunteers and other residents with knowledge about somebody's personal care routines and their preferences, and noting which activities somebody can and still wishes to carry out independently was emphasized in a number of our meetings. Our third category is centered on routines. So many of the personhood tools that our advisory recommended had sections that detailed routine. So beginning with wake up time and morning routine, all the way through to night routine and usual sleep time. And also included in many of the tools were meal and mealtime preferences. Our advisors reiterated the importance of food being incorporated into personhood. They recognized that for many of us, food is not only a necessity, but can also really be an element of personhood that extends beyond nutrition. So thinking beyond somebody's diet, knowing what are their usual food routines, what might be their favorite meal of the day, what foods might be sources of comfort, do they snack throughout the day or have large meals, really understanding this and being able to put it into practice. Our advisors felt it was really important to improving somebody's daily care in life in long-term care. So in our last category, we have additional considerations, and essentially everything in this table is all of the elements that didn't find a home in those other categories. So we have things in here such as coping mechanisms and validation phrases, flagging of unsafe walking patterns, and other safety precautions.
So the next question we wanted to go through was, when should the information be documented and how often should it be updated? And we talked about, especially as we went through the different sectors, about people writing things down really early on so that it's documented. That is especially applicable in the larger tool. And then the tools that come out of that we'll discuss soon. But a person's interests and hobbies might change over time, and particularly they might change if there's a certain interest or a certain illness. Capabilities might fluctuate and decrease as that illness progresses. If there's transitions where they've gone to hospital and are back, that could create some changes that need to be considered and would have to be updated. And also just updating the information should involve ongoing explorations of a change in person's interests, environment, and routines. And I have a bit of a funny example myself. In my mother's situation, she was raised as a young girl, loved to dance. She did the Highland Fling, learned Scottish dancing. She loved dances in general and music. She met my father at a dance. And then in their mid-20s, they became Pentecostal and no longer went to dances, no longer wore makeup, and had a real conversion, life conversion experience. As you can imagine, I spent most of my high school years sneaking out to dances. But as if I had documented that in her document, I would have wrote that in. But as her dementia progressed, she began to dance again. She loved dancing. She would do the Highland Fling at all of the music events. She was teaching me the two-step. So it was something that if I had written it once and left it, they wouldn't have known that that was a joy in her experience, and that had been a change. So when we talk about documenting and updating the personhood information, it should be filled out prior to long-term care. And especially, as we've mentioned, the longer tool is very effective to write all that information down. But then Updates need to be made every 6 months, or that was recommended by our advisory, upon any significant change in health status, behavior, or personhood, or during that time. And also to note that the Long-Term Care Act requires that all residents have a plan of care that details all aspects of care. And that includes medical, nursing, personal support, nutritional, dietary, recreational, social, restorative, religious, and spiritual care. And these plans are to be reviewed and revised every 6 months at a minimum. So we felt that updating the personhood tools at that time was a good way to do it in long-term care. So the next question we would ask is, who might the information be most useful for? And we recognize there's a lot of people who come into touch with a person who lives in long-term care. It's not just the family or friends, although that's some of them. So this is for who these documents would be for, these tools. So family and friends would benefit from knowing these things, even if there had been changes. They also may be the people who help fill them out. But long-term care home staff, frontline staff, nursing, allied health, recreation staff, Behavioural Supports Ontario staff, social worker, director of care, or physicians all really need to know this information to provide good and quality care. Another list that was recommended by our advisors are volunteers. We recognize many homes really live with very vibrant and helpful volunteers that make the home run. And it's important that they also know these aspects of someone and their personhood and the things that they like or dislike. And finally, other residents in the long-term care home to assist in development of friendships between co-residents. It was important that you also know this information.
So moving on to our next question, which is, how can the information be promoted by family care partners? So our recommendations were primarily focused on raising awareness about the importance of personhood tools, and our aim was to create an increase in their use. But our advisors shared with us that, it's one thing to be given a blank all about me form and be asked to fill it out, but it's a whole other thing to actually take the information that is listed in these tools and put it into practice. So wherever possible, our advisors suggested identifying one lead individual who would have the responsibility of alerting others to the existence of a completed tool, and then partner with other relevant staff in order to incorporate relevant content into care planning across sectors. So in terms of how to promote the information from the perspectives of family care partners, our advisors suggested providing staff with permission to share the completed tool with the health team and perhaps allowing them to place it into a secured binder. And many of the tools that we'll go through in a few slides from now really do assist with actioning this piece, because they include a section on the tool where the person that the tool is about, or in some cases their substitute decision maker, can sign off on the document and give permission that it can be shared with others in the long-term care home. We also suggest that in care conferences with family members, we encourage family care partners to provide their input and to help this become part of the resident's plan of care, making sure that this is always based on their needs and preferences.
So the next question was, where might the information be shared, displayed, and or stored? And before we mention this, we do recognize that every individual has the right for privacy and confidentiality of their own personal information. And individuals and their care partners must be consulted before sharing this information, especially if it's sensitive. We talked about low points in their life, that those are sensitive and would need consent. But as Katelynn mentioned, on some of the documents, there's a place to actually sign for permission to share that information, either from the person themselves or their substitute decision maker. So when storing or displaying the information in long-term care, the first place would be in the resident's plan of care, as we discussed earlier, that it's required that long-term care, there's a collaboration of long-term care that can access that information so that they're aware of the needs, interests, and preferences of that individual. Interests can also be incorporated into visual collages. And this is a really great thing where it really shines in long-term care, because this is their home. This isn't a place where they're transitioning like hospital or somewhere. This is something that becomes something that's part of their environment. And you can really get creative in this. And where you show visual collages in the residence room to inform volunteers and visitors of just who the person is. And it's also a good reminder. Sometimes, you know, we walk by and we see just a person in the bed and we forget that they were and that they are a vibrant living person with family, with history, they have previous occupations, they have interests, they're a real person. And this is just sometimes a good visual reminder. Another thing that can happen is that specific elements can be written down separately and posted in different places. So another place that people had recommended was the inside of the closet door. If it was dressing routines or things that trigger the person or things that comfort the person, that would be available inside a closet door or inside a drawer. But that also they could be separated. We had one long-term care home that actually laminates the bath schedule for every resident and keeps that in the bathroom. What comforts them, what don't they like, what do they like, so that can be pulled out from these tools and spread around. Same thing with a dining hall. Their dining routines and things that could be displayed or kept separately, but around the home.
So now we turn our attention to really the nitty-gritty of our document, and we look at what are those tools that our advisory members recommended. So for long-term care, these are the 5 tools, 3 of which are actual personhood tools, and the other two are tools to support the creation of sub-products, which Sharon was just mentioning, the idea of taking specific elements from a completed tool and creating a smaller tip sheet. And we'll further explore this as well in a few more slides. So this is not an exhaustive list of all the tools in existence, but rather these are the ones that resonated most with the members of our advisory. They felt really quite strongly about these first 3 tools, and then using those other 2, the one-page profile templates and the visual collage to help promote. So the 3 tools that Sharon and I will walk through are the All About Me, a conversation starter, which is a shorter version of the full All About Me tool from the Alzheimer's Society. Second is the Pieces of My Personhood tool. And third is the This Is Me. So I'll turn it over to Sharon to talk about the All About Me conversation starter.
Okay, so as Katelynn mentioned, the All About Me comes out of a larger tool that is still very effective. But in long-term care, we were hearing that it's too long, people don't have time to view it. And unfortunately, it meant that it wasn't getting used at all. So the advisory felt this was a good way of getting the key information out in a way that was still user-friendly so that it didn't just get forgotten about. And it's just before we go on, there's one advisor had said, you know, this information, it isn't a pill and it isn't a prescription, but it is still their medicine. And I thought that was really clever. This is still an important part of their care, that we know these elements the same way we would know about an allergy. We need to know who they are to give them the care they need. So the All About Me conversation starter, it has things like, in the past, I was a secretary. It also has the preferred name. I like to be called Margaret. I enjoy, and the different things. She has exercise, movement, singing, bird watching. I don't like. It might be foods. It might be things that make her frightened. Thunder and lightning. Drinking ice cold drinks is in here. Having the television all the time. I don't like that. A typical day for me would include, and as she's mentioned, starting my day with a cup of tea, going for a walk, an hour of quiet time to sit and knit and sew. And although I know in long-term care we can't completely duplicate a person's day, we can help them as best we can to live a way that they've lived comfortably and to make accommodations that will make it good for them and good for the home. And then finally, who knows me best? And it lists the name of people. And these are often names that you would bring up, you would in conversation as a way of starting a conversation, as a way of engaging them, as a way of calming them. So that's the All About Me conversation starter.
The next tool is the Pieces of My Personhood tool, which was developed up here in the northeast area of Ontario. And it's currently being used by all of our Behavioural Supports Ontario teams, including those that work in long-term care. Before diving into the actual sections of the tools, we just wanted to note that a French version for any of our Francophone listeners will soon be available. And it's also been and that's already been pilot tested. And in addition, we're also working on an Indigenous version of the tool, and that one is going to be called Pieces of My Relationships. So really looking forward to sharing those when they come out. So as for the original Pieces of My Personhood tool, it's like I said, it was developed in the Northeast and is currently being used by all of our teams up here. And our lived experience advisors really saw its use across multiple sectors because it's a one-page tool. It looks quite simple, but really the amount of knowledge in the tool is really quite deep. This tool includes items that you've seen in other personhood tools, such as the All About Me conversation starter, things like preferred name, life role, interests, and hobbies. But it also includes items that we previously mentioned, such as sources of hope, comfort, joy, significant high points in life, as well as significant low points in life. As well as coping mechanisms, which proved to be really quite useful in clinical practice and in providing more family-centered care. The Pieces of My Personhood tool also contains instructions to enhance its use, and it includes some tips. And one of the main tips that it also includes is that not all categories might be relevant for every single person. So not every single line needs to be filled out. It is also an example of one of those tools that Sharon and I both mentioned earlier, where the individual that the tool describes or their substitute decision maker can sign off on the bottom to provide that consent for the tool to be shared with other staff. So we thought it might be helpful to walk through a bit of a case study using the Pieces of My Personhood tool to help in actioning it and seeing how it works in practice. So this is a completed tool. The name of the person has been changed. This is a tool describing Joe Jones, who is 78 years old, and he prefers to be called JJ, so I'll refer to him as JJ. So for the majority of JJ's life, he worked evening shift at a local mine up here in the north. And before that, he spent 7 years in the military. He enjoys gardening, fishing, and he had a cat named Charlie prior to his move into long-term care, who was a significant source of joy and comfort for him. He prefers eating late and sleeping in. So from the full completed one-page Pieces of My Personhood, these are examples of a couple of sub-products that Sharon and I both mentioned earlier that can be created to assist staff in better supporting JJ. So on the left is our BSO tip sheet, and it includes strategies and interventions to support JJ because staff reached out to us from his long-term care home saying that he was often presenting with feelings of anxiety, and whenever he was feeling anxious, he would frequently pace the hallways for hours upon hours. So the tip sheet includes things like encouraging JJ to talk about his achievements in the military. He has a couple of his military medals in a shadow box outside of his room. So bringing him there and encouraging him to chat about his achievements. The staff also made him a picture book of cats along with some photos related to fishing, so they can encourage him to have a look at that book whenever he is presenting with some anxiety. And also in relation to his cat Charlie, the BSO staff members were able to locate a large stuffed animal of a cat who looked quite similar to Charlie, and they provided that to JJ to provide that source of comfort. So really quite simple things, but things that have made a world of difference for JJ. There are also a couple of shorter tip sheets, which feature elements of personhood related to a specific activity. So in this case, on that first one, we're looking at JJ's tip sheet for bathing and personal hygiene. JJ is somebody who prefers to shower in the evening. Please do not ask him because he does not want to shave his beard. He likes to keep his facial hair, and he would prefer to have his hair washed last, and for his personal support worker to provide a towel right away as soon as possible, just to provide him comfort. And for breakfast, because we mentioned earlier that JJ was somebody who worked afternoon shifts into the later evening, he is somebody who prefers to sleep in. So he doesn't usually eat much for breakfast, but he may be interested in some cereal and orange juice. He also prefers his coffee with 2 cream, 1 sugar, and in the morning, he's not really a social person. He'd like to read the newspaper while drinking his coffee quietly, and prefer to be either alone, one-on-one, or in a smaller group setting. So that was sort of our more thorough review of the pieces of My Personhood tool, but we also wanted to mention the This Is Me tool because it's really quite similar to the pieces of My Personhood tool. And as I mentioned earlier, this is a tool that was created by the Alzheimer's Society over in the United Kingdom. It has a lot of similar items as the piece of My Personhood, and it's also all on one page. So the This Is Me tool includes elements such as things that may worry or upset me, and it also includes tips for communication, which might really be helpful. It also includes prompts that family or staff could use to assist in gathering information. So related to each of the items, they have small prompts to help with starting those conversations in order to gain that information. So in terms of putting the tools in action, as we worked through our Personhood Tools Making Connections initiative, we came across a few stories, a few newsletter pieces, and came across a few emails from some teams who shared with us how they currently incorporate these tools into their long-term care homes. So in one of the long-term care homes, they have a shadow box with a collage of photos outside every single resident's room. And they also complete the All About Me conversation starter. So that was the tool that one of the long-term care homes uses, more in the southwest of Ontario. Up here in the north, in one of our long-term care homes in a more rural area, every single resident who moves into the long-term care home completes the pieces of My Personhood. In another long-term care home, they post a photo and a brief summary of the person with their preferred name, their previous job or life role, their hobbies, and their important people in a frame above the bed. Of course, they receive permission from the individual or their substitute decision maker before doing so, but they often include information that is not deemed as sensitive as other information that might be included in a larger tool. So they seek permission, and if granted, they have this above each resident's bed in their home. And very interestingly, one of our more urban communities shared with us that every year or every 2 years or so, they collaborate with high school students who are interested in earning their community service credits, and they provide them with the opportunity to volunteer in the long-term care home and spend time with residents and assist them in putting together their personhood tool. So moving into the last piece of our webinar today, Sharon and I wanted to focus on some opportunities for residents' councils and residents to play a role in our initiative.
So first off, we wanted to recommend that you complete a personhood tool or more than one personhood tool to gain experience with the tools by completing them yourself, either on your own or in collaboration with friends and family to share it. I think it would really help you to highlight, well, what would I want people to know about me? What would matter if I couldn't speak for myself? What would make me happy? What would not make me happy? What would matter? And I think of just one example. My mom was a school teacher for a short period of time of her life, but that was a real high point for her. So when she would become restless, you'd think, well, why does the long-term care home need to know she taught school for a few years? But they would actually give my mom papers to mark, and that would calm her. She would just sit at the nurse's station with a few papers, and she could spend an hour there in traveling back in time in her mind, and that was a source of comfort for her. So just really thinking about what would those things be for me, and how maybe I could complete that and share it with staff.
Our second recommendation is to look into advocating for a standard personhood tool to be used in your long-term care home. So Sharon and I looked up the current legislation, which reads that a long-term care home is a resident's primary home and requires all homes to operate in a manner which respectfully preserves each resident's individuality, independence, and dignity within a secure, safe, and comfortable atmosphere while supporting their physical, psychological, social, spiritual, and cultural needs. So essentially, according to the Long-Term Care Homes Act, residence councils, as I'm sure many of you know, have the ability to provide advice and recommendations to the long-term care home based on their suggestions for how to improve care and quality of life. So our recommendation is that if you feel quite strongly about the importance of this initiative and want to take action, we suggest that you look to collaborate with your residence council members to review the different tools. As Sharon said, maybe fill out a few and see which ones might resonate most with those on your residence council, and recommend that one be used in your long-term care home. Because if there is one standard tool that is suggested and put in place in a long-term care home, then there will be a great deal of familiarity and a lot of continuity with the tool if it's completed for every single resident. And our last and third and last recommendation is to collaborate with staff and seek opportunities for involvement. So when Sharon and I looked for research related to the role of residents in long-term care to support their other co-residents, we didn't really find too much, except for the fact that it is often assumed that residents in long-term care homes don't desire to help others because they themselves are receiving assistance on a daily basis. And yet in separate studies, they found that many long-term care residents, in fact, view being helpful to others as an important component of their well-being. There was actually one single study that Sharon and I found where residents who volunteered reported higher levels of well-being, and this actually was really quite beneficial for their health. It was a study, for anybody who's interested, it was a study whereby residents in the US were supporting new immigrants to learn English. And it really showed that many residents can and do wish to play a role in supporting their co-residents. So our recommendation here is to look at opportunities to collaborate with your long-term care home staff and investigate further opportunities where you might be able to become involved in enhancing the use of completed personhood tools. So of course, each home has their own policies, and these would need to be respected, and every long-term care home is individualized. So this might look different from home to home, but it is our recommendation to look at exploring what opportunities there might be.
Okay, so in summary, we want to emphasize that knowing someone and integrating their personhood is essential to the delivery of quality care that is person and family centered for all older adults. We can't care for people if we don't know who they are and what they need. Including elements related to one's personhood into the care plan is also supported by research and is clinical best practice. We recognize that every individual is unique and that not all personhood elements listed will really pertain to each individual. Some things might be left blank, some things will really matter, but this is individualized. We recognize that completing the tools is just the beginning, and that it is important to review responses and integrate them into day-to-day practical care living. As I had said, the idea of giving my mother something to mark because she was a teacher, just a really smart way of honoring who she was, giving her a sense of purpose, but doing it in a practical day-to-day way. That important information such as meal times, bathing, personal hygiene can be segmented and displayed in different locations in the home as needed, also in the person's room as needed. And that it is essential to update the tool. While some elements might not fluctuate, like past occupations, pets, that hobbies, interests, and preferences may change over time. And finally, something I've seen time and time again in our own home, and that is that co-residents can and do play an important role in delivering person and family-centered care. That you're their neighbor, you're their friend, and that it is very possible for you to enhance their lives through the use of personhood tools.
So we came up with a couple of discussion questions related to our webinar today. So of course, we're open to answering any other questions, but thought that we might put in a couple to enhance our learning. So we're wondering if anyone on our webinar today has any experience with any of the tools listed in our recommendations or any other personhood tools. We're wondering what this experience has been like and how it has impacted your health and social well-being while living in long-term care. And in our webinar, we suggested 3 ways that residents and residents councils could consider becoming involved in this initiative. So we're wondering what your thoughts are on these approaches and if you have any other ideas. And I see that we have about 15 minutes remaining. So I'm not sure, Josie, if we can open the lines.
Sure. So I'm actually going to ask, just because we do have quite a few attendees on the line, which is wonderful, that if you would like to speak up, please unmute your own line, just so there's not a chaos of noise as I unmute everyone. And while you're gathering your thoughts, I do see that Sharon Cook has responded in the chat box, and I'll just share some of her thoughts. She has said that through activation programs, residents could also ask that the staff, along with the Residents Council leadership team, do an education session on personhood tools as a program so that residents are able to complete them in the future so that they have a better understanding of the tools themselves.
That's a great idea. And thank you so much for adding that, Sharon Cook, I should say. And I think many of you might be aware, but Sharon Cook played a wonderful role in helping us form these recommendations. So sincere thank you to both Sharons, really. From my part, it's Katelynn speaking, in all of your dedication to this initiative.
Is there anybody else on the line that would like to comment on the discussion questions, either through the chat box, and I'm more than happy to read them out, or again, you can unmute your lines at the top of your toolbar there. You'll see that you can push the microphone and it'll go green, and that will bring you live on the air. We'll just give everybody a couple of minutes to gather their thoughts. Okay, so it doesn't look like there's anybody else who is looking to speak up or share any ideas. I do see that Sharon here has commented once more, saying that she feels that it's an excellent idea for Residents Council leadership teams to work together with the staff collaboratively to enhance the relationship within the home. And we do have one more comment here from Southampton Care Centre. Our Residents Council has hired students through the Canada Summer programs to complete life stories.
That's wonderful to hear. I see the comments coming from Brenda. Yes. That's very, very interesting. And I know from the experience of the urban long-term care home in the Northeast who provides the opportunity for those community credits for the high school students. That's really quite, I think, a wonderful experience from both ends. I think bringing in younger individuals into long-term care homes helps to foster some intergenerational relationships. I think it also demystifies long-term care a lot as well. And then the residents who participate in those programs come out with these wonderful products. I've seen some of those life stories that are 30 and 40 pages long, which are really quite a wonderful read. So really great to hear.
We also had a few more comments coming in quite quickly. Let me see if I can gather some of these thoughts. One person has wrote in saying that they have a binder in the nursing station with a short summary of everyone so that they can have a quick read and they know what they need to know about each resident. We also had somebody else writing in saying that they have a co-op student working on the initiative of All About Me with the support from their president of Residents Council. And we have one more comment here from Extendicare Rouge Valley, who had 33 people gather for a presentation, including 20 residents who were interested in the personhood tools. We are going to have a discussion immediately following this. Wow, so it sounds like they had 33 people on today gathered around for today's webinar, which is wonderful to hear. So they're going to have a discussion immediately following this to share with their home and to get feedback from the residents, and their BSO and recreation staff will present our tools, particularly the All About Me. So thank you for sharing that, and thank you to Rouge Valley for all of the audience today.
Thank you so much for coming.
So there's lots of good conversation happening in the chat box. A few more comments around life histories and having residents, the rooms having information so that the staff are aware, can have conversation with residents upon entering the rooms. So thank you for everybody who's wrote in to share their experience, to participate in the discussion questions this afternoon. We would certainly love to continue to hear all of your stories and success. I'm sure Katelynn and Sharon would love to know how other homes are using them as well. I think today was an excellent presentation. So thank you, Katelynn and Sharon. Lots of ideas and information to take back. I love that you ended off your presentation with 3 recommendations. I think that's something for residents' councils and long-term care homes to really sink their teeth into. So thank you for those recommendations. And thank you very much for your wonderful presentation and your time this afternoon. For those of you left on the call, I would like to remind you that today's presentation, along with the tools that have been discussed, are available to all of you in the materials section of your tab bar, so you can certainly download those for easy access and immediate use. And I would like to thank everybody on the line for their time this afternoon. Thank you for coming out and participating in OARC's webinar, and bye for now. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Josie. And I think just to reiterate what you had just said, in response to the Rouge Valley team, if they're still on the line, that if any of you pursue this initiative and implement any of the recommendations in our document, we would absolutely love to hear from you. So please drop either Sharon or I a line, or send us an email. We'd be happy to chat further and support you in putting this in place. So thank you again to Josie Lee and the OARC team and my wonderful co-presenter Sharon. We're really looking forward to disseminating all of this work further.
Absolutely. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
Take
Bye
care.
now.